Hello everyone! The beginning of a new week means the next round of beta changes for the upcoming 5.0 characters. While Kinich and Kachina only received minor changes in the previous beta update, Mualani was a big point of discussion because of the massive nerfs she received in the previous week, and unfortunately this trend does continue with this week of beta changes. While Kinich and Kachina are continuing to be just fine, Mualani has received even more nerfs to her overall kit. But are the nerfs actually that bad? With some additional changes being added to Mualani's kit, I would argue she's still in a decent spot in the overall Genshin meta. So in this video, I will briefly cover and analyze all the recent updates to the 5.0 character kits. So let's start off with the elephant in the room, Mualani. In the middle of last week, prominent leaker Foul suggested that Mualani was expected to get another multiplier nerf in the next beta update. And this information is correct, but there were also some other significant changes that were not initially mentioned. Let's start out with the multipliers first. While Mualani's burst got around an 8% HP multiplier increase at talent level 10, Mualani's skill, which is the main source of her damage, took another heavy decrease in multipliers. This time all the multipliers were decreased, so whether you're doing an uncharged shark bite, a partially charged shark bite, or a fully charged one, you'll be doing less damage. Doing the math on a fully charged enhanced normal, Mualani's Sharky's surging bite now only has a 78.1% HP multiplier. It was originally around 130% with the initial kit and 113% after her first nerf. Like I mentioned with the discussion of her first nerf, if this was an attack multiplier, the number decrease wouldn't be that bad, but because it is an HP scaling multiplier, the multiplier decrease is quite significant, and going from 113 to 78% is an even larger decrease than the original nerf of 130 to 113%. To counteract this big number nerf, however, 3 buffs were made to Mualani. First, while Mualani is in her skill enhanced state riding her shark, her normal attacks had a 2-second cooldown. Now it's 1.6 seconds. Second, the stack generation interval per enemy while Mualani is surfing was decreased from 0.8 seconds to 0.7 seconds. And third, her A1 passive was buffed to give more Night Soul points when Mualani picked up her floater, which she spawned when she performs a fully stacked enhanced normal. Now what do these changes mean, you might be asking? Well, in summary, these changes allow Mualani to attack more often, increases the speed in which Mualani can get stacks to empower her attacks, and increases Mualani's overall uptime per skill. So in theory, these changes would allow Mualani to get more attacks in, which would counteract the damage nerfs and also somewhat alleviate the gameplay concerns of her having less consistent damage from having fewer hits. Now initially, according to private server testers, you were only able to get 3 fully charged shark bites, thus no extra attacks from Mualani. The reason is that in all previous iterations of Mualani's kit, all the theory crafters I followed have assumed that Mualani does 3 hits per skill usage. Most recently, sheets were calculating Mualani performing 2 fully stacked shark bites with a third 2-stacked shark bite, totaling 3 hits in single target. But luckily, after more testing from people with private servers and them sharing gameplay clips which I've personally seen, they have managed to fit in an extra 1-stack enhanced normal attack with the changes to Mualani. This may not seem much, but remember that Mualani's kit is designed to not have that many hits every rotation, so any extra hit she can perform does matter for both damage and gameplay comfort. Now, does this extra hit counteract the big multiplier nerfs Mualani received? To give some context, I want to share Jstern's quick calculation comparison of how Mualani's personal damage was changed throughout these 3 iterations of her kit with different rotation assumptions, which has been supported by other theory crafters in this community doing some updated team calculations. Again, great TCR, highly recommend checking him out. So obviously, if we compare any of the current numbers to the original version of her kit, it doesn't look very good. Her original numbers were just that cracked. But if we compare her damage after her first nerf and after this week's changes, the damage difference isn't that big. Even when comparing both the easy rotations and the optimized rotations, her damage only decreased by around 2 to 3% with the most recent changes. And honestly, that's not that bad when you consider her continual decrease in her multipliers. And with the extra attack you can get per skill, you could argue that it helps with her potential gameplay clunkiness. However, make no mistake, damage-wise, these changes are still an overall damage nerf. Now in AoE, where Mualani is able to surf against multiple enemies, the increase in stack generation does actually allow for fully stacked shark bites, which is pretty good. And because of this and the shark missiles that Mualani can spawn when she marks multiple enemies, her AoE is actually quite good. In fact, numbers wise, it is actually potentially better than Nerfed, which I find really funny because the original consensus and assumption was that Mualani would be a damage dealer that would deal very good single target damage, but AoE would be still dominated by Nerfed. But at her current state, it's actually looking like the opposite. Mualani can have on paper better AoE damage, and Neuvillette actually has on paper higher single target damage. Of course, this is just sheet comparisons, and Mualani's AoE is heavily dependent on enemies that are already grouped together, but it is still interesting to note nevertheless. Unfortunately, the Mualani nerfs do not just end here. Her particle generation was also nerfed. Originally, every skill gave 5 particles. Now, it is a 50-50 whether you get 4 or 5 particles, so average 4.5 particles. To me, this seems completely unnecessary, and it just feels like a nerf just to nerf her even more. On top of that, her constellations also just got nerfed. For her C1, the extra damage to Mualani's first Sharky Surging Bite and any missiles it spawned was decreased. C2 got a slight buff in the extra Night Soul points generated, but this doesn't change much however, as C2 still allows an extra fully stacked attack for Mualani. C4 gives Mualani extra energy, but the extra damage to her burst was heavily reduced. And lastly, they removed the extra crit given to her attacks at C6. Her constellations are still quite strong, specifically C1 and C6, but it is surprising to me that literally everything was nerfed about Mualani. With all of Mualani's beta changes, she might just be the most nerfed character in any beta I've seen ever since launch. It's quite interesting to see how conservative HOYOverse is in balancing her. Despite this, her team damage is honestly fine. On paper, it's still indicative of an above average DPS, so Mualani is by no means bad. But when you think about her original kit iteration, then her current state is underwhelming with the direction of HOYOverse's balance changes. We've gotten to the point where one of her best teams based on sheet DPS is Mono Hydro because of the massive multiplier nerf she received. Vaporized teams are still good, and some team versions are better than Mono Hydro, but when considering Mualani was designed to be a vaporized carry, and at the current moment, vaporized teams aren't massively ahead even if that's her niche, to me this shows some sort of failure of Hoyo's balancing team. Now I think it's quite obvious why HOYOverse is being so conservative with Mualani's numbers. We know that the Pyro Archon is coming out, which is likely to be a much better source of off-field pyro application than Xiangling, and might even buff like Bennett. And we've gotten some small crumbs on Shilonen's kit, who may provide res shred. If this is true, then both of these units will drastically buff Mualani to the point where her numbers will likely make her a top tier DPS. But as always, needing to pull on future characters to make a current character better just feels bad, and this is obviously a tactic for HOYOverse to get you to spend more money, and it sadly works. Similar thing happened with Neuvillette and Farina. So in the long run, Mualani will do fine. She technically is still kinda fine right now. It just feels really bad for HOYOverse to intentionally gimp a character so much right now. My heart goes to all of you Mualani mains. But enough about Mualani, let's move on to Kinich. And if you're a Kinich main, you're eating good. This time around, all he got were buffs. The multipliers of his normal attacks after using his skill were decreased, but the cannonball shot you fire after getting enough Night Soul points was increased. Since this was a bigger source of his damage, this is an overall damage buff at C0. I believe a 5% increase was the number being thrown around. His constellations also got buffed. The extra crit damage from his C1 was increased, and he even gains more movement speed from the out of combat benefits of his C1. C4 now has an additional 70% damage increase to Kinich's burst, and while the multiplier of his C6 bounce attack was nerfed, the attack now gets buffed by Kinich's A4 and C2, which is great. Kinich was already looking like a solid DPS, especially with Emily, so just a straight buff across the board is nice. And lastly, Kachina. Kachina's kit did not get touched at all. The only thing somewhat relevant to Kachina is that both the craftable polearm and the sword, which give defense, were buffed, as the defense given after using an elemental skill now lasts 15 seconds instead of 10 seconds. So if you're planning on using the new polearm on Kachina, it's a small buff. And those were all the character kit changes for this week's beta update. There is still one main beta update left next week, so drastic changes still can occur. If you're a Kinich or a Kachina enjoyer, you might want to pray for no changes. In terms of Mualani, I hope she gets buffed. She's gotten so many nerfs, the girl needs some love. However, looking at the pattern of nerfs, my confidence is dwindling, and it really seems like the nerfs are intentional to balance Mualani around future characters. But who knows, we'll just have to wait for the upcoming weeks. If you enjoyed this update and analysis video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. You will definitely want to follow for the news of the conclusion of this 5.0 beta cycle. As always, leave your thoughts and questions in the comments below, and join the Discord if you have any specific questions for me or just want to chat about any beta updates. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.